Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. It's a great pleasure to see you all. We are staff all in our lovely institute in London, and it's great that people can tune in from everywhere in the world. As you obviously have realized by looking at the program, our speakers also all from different parts of the world. Katie Meheux is in London and speaking from UCL. I don't know, are you speaking from UCL, Katie? Anyway, you're certainly somewhere in London. And Peter Rohrbacher and Victoria Immervoll are from Vienna, where they are at present. And Maxime Brami, who is also our Curl lecturer next week, is speaking to us from Mainz. So it is wonderful that we can all come together. Now, with regard to our subject of today, a couple of little points that I just wanted to flag up before we start. I mean, one of them is, of course, Gordon Childe, the subject of our discussion today, was a fellow and librarian of our institute at a crucial time when he was developing his writings. And our kind of image of him is that he basically just read books and wrote letters about his academic work all day whilst he was librarian. And so we really think that this was a crucial part of his academic development. And of course, historically, what's so terribly interesting is it's just before anthropology split into its respective subdisciplines of social anthropology, archaeology, biological anthropology, linguistic anthropology, perhaps a little bit less clearly defined so markedly. And so the different subject areas that we're talking about, for example, tended to get attached into one discipline or another. So diffusion, an absolutely key part of Gordon Childe's message, of course, eventually began more or less to be subsumed under the aegis of archaeology. But before that point, the general consideration of diffusion could also have been treated by people who were calling themselves anthropologists at the same time. And so, in a way, the study of diffusion and prehistory got taken out of one branch of anthropology and put into another, with some really quite complex intellectual ramifications. You could argue an impoverishment of one side and an enrichment of the other. But perhaps such stark divisions were no longer necessary, and certainly they're no longer so necessary today. But looking at these historical patterns, of course, is absolutely fascinating, and that is the background to what we're doing today. Anyway, that's enough for me. So what we'll do is we'll welcome our speakers to go about 20 minutes each, without a break, and then we'll move into our discussion. So I would like to invite Katie Meheux to begin our deliberations. So the floor is yours, Katie.
Okay, thank you, David. I'll just share my screen. Now, share screen. So David asked me just before that I began my lecture was just to give a quick kind of look over Gordon Childe and his career. So a quick review of him. So he studied from 1911 to 1914 at the University of Sydney. He was an Australian by birth. In 1914, he came and studied at Queen's College at the University of Oxford. He then returned to Australia and became involved in Australian politics until 1922. In 1922, he returned as part of this Australian politics to Britain, was sacked with a change of government, and changed his mind and went back to archaeology again. In 1925, as David has already mentioned, he became librarian of the Royal Anthropological Institute. In 1927, he then became Abercromby Professor of Prehistoric Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, which was a new position, and he remained there until 1946. In 1946, he became Director and Professor of Prehistoric European Archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology, which was then part of the University of London. And he remained in position there until 1956, when he retired. On his retirement, he returned to Australia and died in what was originally mysterious circumstances in the Blue Mountains in Australia. In the 1980s, it was revealed with the discovery of his suicide note that he had committed suicide in 1957 in Australia. Now, Childe wrote an enormous range of publications during his life, and I couldn't possibly list all of them. But what I've done is listed the most important ones in terms of the European perspective that we're looking at today, and some of his most famous ones. So he started with the dawn of European civilization, the Danube in prehistory, and then you get in the kind of the middle area, his most famous kind of books written for the public, Man Makes Himself and What Happened in History. His last book, which was published after his death, he returned again to the subject that started him off, the Prehistory of European Societies. Now, Childe is without question one of the most preeminent prehistorians of the 20th century. He's famous not only for his work in prehistory, but also for his work in archaeological theory, and he's famously a Marxist archaeology. His shadow falls across European archaeology and prehistory in general, and the late Andrew Sherratt said of him that when you do prehistory, it is basically what he called a dialogue with the ghost of Gordon Childe. So having given everyone a little bit of an introduction to Childe, I'm going to now move on and give you my quick 20 minutes lecture. Now, what I'm going to do is set the scene. So I'm going to look at the travels, the activities and networks of Gordon Childe in the 1920s. Now, those networks, those travels, those activities are well established. We have strong narratives written on solid research, for example, famously by Sally Green. And in terms of Europe, we have a lot of work done by the Polish archaeologist Jacek Lek. The problem, however, with these narratives, no matter how strong and detailed they are, is that they are now beginning to age. Many of them are 20, 30 years old, and it's time to review them, to expand them, and when necessary, also challenge them. In the 21st century, we now have new sources of evidence available to us. For example, you see here on the left, new archives. The Keeler archives at the Keeler Museum in Avebury are one of our earliest archives associated with material with Childe in it. We also have a range of new electronic tools which allow us to see Childe's work more widely. We can, for example, have electronic access to historical journal archives, which allow us to see his early work in the 1920s. We have an enormous range across Europe of open access historical newspapers, which I personally find are an amazing source for research on Childe's life. We also need to start to think outside the box a little bit when we do our research on Childe. And I, for example, use the Childe pamphlet archive, which is part of my library collection. And I also have within my library the remnants of the Childe library. Now, this Hungarian book that you see here, that you have a picture of, tells us without question and answers one of the questions about Hungarian archaeology and Childe, as we can see that he did go to Hungary before 1926. We can see from this book that he was in Hungary in 1922 at Christmas because he wrote in his own book. These wider new sources of information give us new perspectives on Childe's career. They give us new detailed perspectives. They allow us to see how Childe's career developed. And we can see it wasn't a simple matter of becoming librarian of the Royal Anthropological Institute, doing a little bit of reading, and then moving on to become Abercromby Professor. When we look at these varied sources, we can see he actually moved through quite a standard academic career. He did a lot of lecturing, he did a lot of publishing, he did a lot of traveling, but he worked his way up and he was sponsored and he also did the work himself. But when I look at these different sources, I can see that he actually established a lot of his career in the early days. Now, there are many of Childe's notebooks in the Childe Archive and UCR records, and we can date them from the 1920s through to the 1950s. And it's clear from the notebooks that Childe had an incredibly visual memory. All of the notebooks are filled with drawings of his work. And I have some other archives that date from the 1950s, which are student records, and he even marked student work with these drawings. Another trend that I've noticed is Childe's tendency to float new ideas through lectures and public dialogue. And we can see from the Monroe lectures, which are reported only in newspapers, that he often tried ideas out, particularly in these Monroe lectures. And we can also see from very early on in the work he did for the Plebs Education magazine, this interest in public education, making archaeology widely available to the public. We can also see how little he had available to him in terms of British archaeological journals to actually publish in. And you can see how undeveloped British archaeology was at the time. And I think this was some of the fascination of his colleagues in continental Europe and Austria, is that they had a much better developed archaeology organization at the time. As David said, Childe was also an anthropologist, and I think part of our reviewing of Childe is to see him differently. There are many examples we can quote of Childe as an anthropologist, but I've just put 3 here. There's a newspaper report from him joining the Edinburgh and Lothians branch when he went to Edinburgh in 1927, a testimonial from one of his friends, Solly Zuckerman, and another testimonial, kind of a nice philosophical one, written by Christopher Hawkes to Anthony Christie, saying how much Childe tried to keep social anthropology and archaeology together. And there's this letter on the side where he really states what he wants to say. And Childe's handwriting is quite difficult, so I'll just read the key bit. I am personally against any disassociation of prehistoric archaeology from anthropology. The two subjects are indissolubly linked, par se Malinowski, and prehistoric archaeology would certainly lose by being mixed up with classicals and medievalists, though it might be good for them. And this, I think, really emphasizes his interest in association with archaeology, but also with anthropology. Looking across the range of these new sources, I can see basically 5 new centres that he said that were real focus of his network. Oxford, the Royal Anthropological Institute, new archaeologists, the British School of Diffusionists, and his European connections. Now, all of these mixed in together, and they were not in any way in silos. There was much interchange between them. And you can see a lovely example of this from a Hungarian newspaper. It's actually a mistake, but you can see it's a story about Childe coming to visit them. And it says here that he's from Oxford, but it says Oxford 52 Upper Bedford Place, which was actually the address of the Royal Anthropological Institute. So you can see this closeness of continental archaeology, anthropology, and archaeology. Now, what I find astonishing about Childe is how much these different groups of people were at each other's throats. But during the 1920s, Childe managed an incredible balancing act where he managed to maintain relations with all of these people. And Childe's work, not just now, but in fact, throughout his career, is a wonderful unity of pulling in all elements from these diverse and quarrelsome people and blend it into something completely new. We have to be aware that these networks occurred not only when Childe travelled abroad, as he did, for example, to the Moravian Museum, but also the networks he found with his colleagues back in Britain. Now, he was close friends with Malinowski, and I have a lovely quote from Malinowski here, which shows this awareness that he found back in Britain about Kultur. Now, Malinowski said, Kultur is really borrowed from German, where Kultur means civilization, with its fine shade of meaning, not implied in English culture. So at home, as well as abroad, Childe was exposed to these continental ideas. I think it's also important to be aware that Childe, although a bridge between Britain and the continent, was not the only one. And I think seeing him as an isolated bridging finger is perhaps a Cold War perspective that we need to shift. Now, when you look at archives, when you look at the records of the Royal Anthropological Institute, when you look at their journal, you can see that scholars were going backwards and forwards all the time, both before Childe and to a lesser extent after him. And here on the right is one of those who travelled greatly, Abbe Breuil, who famously travelled backwards and forwards and, like Childe, had connections across Europe and including in Britain. But we also have to be aware that after the war, the nature of Childe's contacts with the continent began to change. He retained many of the friendships and connections he made at this time during the 1920s, but you begin to get this very strong communist element in his work. Now, when you look at the publishers of Childe's later work on the continent, particularly in the Warsaw Pact countries, you can see that many of those publications were done by big communist publishing houses or earlier on by communist parties. And to an extent, I think Childe did encourage this. I can see from the Penguin archives, for example, that Childe was selective about the publishers he chose to kind of present his work in Europe. So Childe himself, to an extent, introduced this element of Marxism and communism into his continental connections. So how did it all begin? Well, it all began at Oxford, and it all began with two men, John Myers and Arthur Evans. Now, these men between them seem to have done a great deal to supervise and encourage Childe's work between 1914 and 1917. Now, it was because of them and the contacts he formed, particularly around the Ashmolean, that when he came back to archaeology, he came straight back to look at what he'd been doing before in his undergraduate day, in his days at Oxford. Now, he had many contacts at the Ashmolean Museum, and we can see this quite clearly with Evans, and he accounted here for the first time the painted Neolithic pottery that was to be central to his interest. Now, you get the impression when you look over the letters he wrote to Myers that he assumed that when he returned to archaeology, he would get a job easily within Oxford. But this was not to be the case. Childe had been an active war resister during his time studying at Oxford, and Oxford were very opposed to having him come back and work with them. He tried for several jobs in Oxford, but he was unable to get to any of them. And I think this created this need to create a slightly different, slightly varied career path than just coming back and going to work in a university, particularly for Oxford. Now, what I find very fascinating is the influence of Evans' work in particular on the dawn of civilizations and ultimately feeding into kind of Childe's contributions to European archaeology. Now, you can see this very, very clearly. And on the left, I have illustrations from the dawn and illustrations from Knossos. Childe basically copied the illustrations from the Knossos book. And he did this with many of the circle of friends who were around the Ashmolean. And also from this Childe archive, you have one of these very elaborate chronologies that Childe created. And these were actually based on Evans's work. Now, at the same time, although we've had this strong link with Oxford, I can also see when I look at Childe's career paths, strong continental influences. So this man, Karol Hadacek, was a student of Hernes, and his career path was very similar to Childe. So he went from an interest in Greek and Roman archaeology, particularly Greek archaeology. He moved up into the kind of the Balkan area, and then from the Balkans and his interest in the painted Neolithic pottery, he then moved into Central European Neolithic studies. So Childe's career, although on the surface it looks very British, it also has very strong European parallels as well. So because he didn't go the Oxford route, he went instead the route of the Royal Anthropological Institute. You can see from the pamphlet that you see on the right-hand side that he kind of really strongly identified with them. And on the left, you can see his sponsorship in 1923. Now, in the RAI, he found himself with some very powerful allies. He had Harold Peake, who is a shadowy figure, but was very influential in British archaeology. Edith Durham, who assisted him in his work with the library, who was a Balkan specialist, and Charles Seligman, who was very influential in his career, and also H.S. Harrison, who was the manager of the Horniman Museum. I can see elements of influence from him as well. Now, Seligman's influence is something that I think has gone very much under the wire because we focus on Myers as the kind of the real supporter of Childe during this time. But from the letter on the right, you can see it was actually Fallais and Seligman rather than Myers who set Childe up with his position as librarian. I also find it fascinating the fact that early in his career, in 1923, they put him onto the committee to organise Section H Anthropology for the British Association of the Advancements of Science. So you can see that they're making Childe's career and supporting him, not only in getting him a job, but they're getting him into positions of power and responsibility. on the other way round, looking at it differently, another letter I've seen is when Childe writes to his friend at the British Museum, Thomas Kendrick, saying, Falaise wants me to suddenly kind of quickly write an article for him for the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute with a pretty plate and something of interest. So it was to their advantage to have this very brilliant archaeologist at hand to do work for them. So it wasn't a completely disinterested promotion of Childe's career. Childe also became associated with the British School of Diffusionists, who were based in UCL Anthropology. And he made some incredibly strong lifelong friendships there. So Charles Singer, Solly Zuckerman, Australian A.P. Elkin, Darrell Ford, who he excavated and travelled with, and the archaeologist John Layard, who he's also friendly with as well. Now, he was of two minds, I think, about the work of the British School of Diffusionists, and had a kind of slightly rocky relationship, perhaps, with Eliot Grafton Smith. So he is not, as you see from the text you see in the middle, 100% convinced about their ideas of hyperdiffusionism. But I think he got involved with them through A.P. Elkin in the hope that possibly there was some work there, because Grafton Eliot Smith supported Australians. I think what was the real bridge between for Childe that allowed him to balance the different tensions he saw, and this is not very well known, is that LSE and UCL, whilst they were fighting this kind of diffusion controversy, they were also bound together by having to teach anthropology for the University of London. So whilst they were fighting one another, they were also teaching together and setting exam papers together. And I think this is the context in which we see William Perry thanking Sidney Smith and Gordon Childe for preparing his book, which was published in 1926, which was the year that Childe started to do a little bit of teaching for LSE. Now, what kind of broke this relationship up was the influence of new archaeologists, particularly the man on the left here of the crocodile, which is O.G.S. Crawford, who was one of the most influential of new archaeologists. Now, Crawford in particular was a very precise field archaeologist, and they had very little respect for the field work done by Eliot Grafton Smith and his associates. Now, the split between the British School of Diffusionists and the new archaeologists came in two ways. We find around about 1927 a lot of discussion and kind of mudslinging over the excavation of this barrow cemetery done by Eliot Smith. The Five Knolls Barrow Cemetery was done by the University College Hospital Archaeological Society, led by Eliot Smith, and it was ripped to shreds in print by the new archaeologists. Childe himself kind of stepped back a little bit, I think, until the Glozell controversy. And at that point, because it was supported by those he called distinguished folklorists, anatomists, and classicists, he decides by this time that he's going to jump ship and really kind of make himself part of the new archaeologists. And I think the logic behind this is that Childe is increasingly seeing archaeology as a science. And as he sees it as a science, he can no longer take on board these hyper-diffusionist perspectives in the same way. And at the last area that I'm going to look at is these European connections, the travel, the network, the research, and the reputation he built. I think it's quite useful at this point to compare the map from the Danube in Prehistory and a map of the extent of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you can immediately see at a glance that most of the countries that Childe wandered over had once been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the anthropological and the archaeological influence that he's encountering again and again in the 1920s ultimately were formed before the war within this milieu. Now, I think he was very interested in wandering this area because he's interested in chronologies. Now, we see this in particular when he's looking at the type sites of Vinca and Tosek, but not everybody was 100% committed or convinced by Childe's search for a European-wide chronology. And you can see that the archaeologist Walter Braemar is criticizing here. He's saying it would take too much time to disprove Childe's theories in full, but he's a bit concerned about this, trying to go into the European chronology, get a date for the European Bronze Age, the Danube, and Central Europe. So he's slightly uneasy about it. And I think it's important that we have this critical voice in, as well as the fact that everyone thought the dawn was amazing. Yes, they did, but not everybody was 100% sure. Now, Childe took his responsibilities for building bridges, particularly with conquered colleagues in Germany and Austria-Hungary, very carefully. He was very supportive and very keen to see European archaeologists get back together as a coherent group. Now, here we have a lovely letter that he wrote to the British Museum asking permission to publish this hoard. And he says, I think it will be appreciated by the archaeologists who are concerned with Central European matters. So he's aware perhaps they can't get to this material themselves. So he wants to help get them this information. And he passes on the details to his colleague at the University of Hanover. So you can see him working as a link, linking together all these different groups. We also need to be aware that we need to go back and review some of our views and the details we have. Now, it's long been thought that Childe dug with Leon Kozłowski in 1923, but actually, when I was looking for something else completely, I came across this very interesting newspaper report where Childe himself says that he excavated at the site of Kościuszówce in 1924. Now, this means that either he went and excavated there twice, or he got the date wrong himself, or he excavated in 1924. And whilst it's only a minor point, it does make us realize that sometimes we need to go back and review the ideas we have and some of these things that we've accepted almost as kind of orthodox narrative, and check them again. And in particular, listen to Childe's voice, not what other people say about Childe. Now, just as you are going to hear how much Childe was influenced by Austrian anthropology, when I look through the archaeological information, I can see a kind of correspondence, fascination, and influence interest with Hungary. Now, you can see here a very early pamphlet from Cluj in Hungary. A lot of the pictures, particularly of the finds that we find in Danube in Prehistory, come from Hungary. And I also discovered from Hungarian newspapers that Childe excavated in Hungary in another place as well as Toseg. Now, he's known to have excavated in Toseg, but he also excavated, according to the newspapers, in this place called Vészlay, which is another one of these prehistoric sites in Hungary. Now, to my mind, this raises the question that perhaps we do not know Childe's European connection and his activities perhaps as well as we should. Now, it's often said that Childe's first excavation was Toseg, or his first excavations was Kościuszówce. This, to my mind, brings into the question the fact that perhaps Childe had more European archaeological excavation experience than we actually have known previously. We just haven't found it. So to pull this all together, Childe's early career and thought provided a template for his later activities and careers. It was rooted strongly in both anthropology and archaeology, and as such, as David said earlier, reflected the strong contemporary links between the two subjects. Childe, although part of the new archaeologists, worked very hard to maintain the links between the subjects. And I feel strongly that concentration on his later work and thought, particularly his Marxism, has been at the extent of this very fascinating, essentially European career. And I think there's a lot we can do to redress this balance. And to pass on to my colleagues now looking at Austrian anthropology and archaeology, we have this postcard that he sent his friend Crowther, in which he praises Austrian and French wine. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Katie, for getting us off to that absolutely splendid start. As always with these things, one has so many questions, but we're going to have to restrain ourselves, I think, and move on now. I now would like to welcome Maxime Brami. The floor is yours, Maxime. So colleagues, just to say, do push your questions into the Q&A box whenever you want to. But go ahead, Maxime.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, so go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I want to thank David Shankland and the RAI for hosting this event. So I have to explain a little bit. I'm a prehistoric archaeologist working on the Neolithic. So I've been very interested in the career of Gordon Childe because he defined the Neolithic revolution. That's one of his main contributions to prehistoric archaeology. And as part of this, I wanted to understand where the Neolithic revolution came from. And that's how I encountered Austrian diffusionism, and especially what Gordon Childe called the method of culture cycles, which is already a very personal take on something which in Germany and in Austria is called the Kulturkreislehre, which you might translate more literally as culture area theory or culture circles. I think my colleagues are going to talk more about it, but I just want to give you some insights on this, because I think it was very important for the development of his thinking. So what you can see here is a slide showing Gordon Childe's Neolithic revolution from Man Makes Himself, and Man Makes Himself is, as Katie explained already, arrived at the very end of already a long sequence of books. The first one being Man Makes Himself, being The Dawn of European Civilization in 1925, and in Man Makes Himself, Gordon Childe defines 3 revolutions in history, and you can map it onto some more recent historical work. I've done it here with Ian Morris, Why the West Rules for Now. But the idea is that there are three revolutions in history, and the first one, the Neolithic Revolution, is basically when food gatherers become food producers, when hunters and gatherers invent farming, and this is a key innovation in human history. But not only that, there are other aspects which are linked to this. So you might say a Neolithic economy is, or domestic economy is, where the goods are produced where they are consumed. In an urban or town economy, there are many hands between producers and consumers. And in an industrial or national economy, you could say that the goods are produced in one part of the country and then consumed in another part of the country. So it's about the scale of production. And of course, the next stage might be a global economy where one country produces goods and another country consumes them. So what is already clear, from this idea of 3 revolutions in history is that you are dealing with something like an evolutionary scheme. But you will see that diffusion is also a very important aspect. So it's, as Katie explains, it's a very interesting balancing act between different things. So I think one mistake that we tend to do when we look at Gordon Childe's early career and his career in general is that we tend to think of his work as very as monolithic. And in fact, if you look at some of his early syntheses, and these are only some of his books, there are more books. So he published an incredible amount of books from 1925 to 1936. What I did is just look at how many times specific words appear in his early synthesis. And what you might notice is in his very early work, like The Dawn of European Civilization, the Aryans, he was concerned with the word civilization. And as you progress in time, you can see that the word civilization appears less and less in his work. You might say the word culture is there from the beginning, but I think the period when culture was most important in his work is around the time when he wrote the Danube in Prehistory, which might be described today as his most culture historical work. And words like agriculture, Neolithic, they appear throughout this period, but in combination with revolution, I think this is something that appears quite late in the sequence of writings, more in the 1930s, culminating with the publication of Man Makes Himself. You can also, if you read all of these books, you will also notice that there are specific explanations from 1925 all the way to 1936. So his early works is concerned with migration, especially the Aryans. It's incredibly migrationist. And especially in the 1920s, late 1920s, it's more and more concerned with diffusion. And his later book, Man Makes Himself, is already going to something else, which is the functionalism of Malinowski. So I just wanted to, I want to focus on these two words, culture and diffusionism, because I think this is what he took from, especially from the Austrian school of diffusionism. So Childe writes and talks quite extensively in his work about the method of culture cycles. He did so in 1935 in this presidential address to the Prehistoric Society. And in there, he says it's a revolutionary innovation, but it hasn't really been tried. And he says that the Austrian school of diffusionism has a different explanation than the British one, which is quite interesting. He says that, okay, I have to read this, the very traits widely dispersed among savage cultures that our diffusionists, so he's talking about the British school of diffusionism, cite as degenerate and distorted borrowings from the ancient East are interpreted there as survivals from primitive culture cycles that began to spread over the years in Pleistocene times. It is this ethnographic conception that Professor Mainz has applied to prehistoric archaeology in such a stimulating and suggestive way. And we will hear more about Mainz in a minute. He also expresses 4 reservations. He says, first of all, these categories, the culture cycles, are coming from ethnography, and Mainz is trying to impose archaeological data onto ethnographic categories. He also says no culture cycles can be observed functioning in purity today. And he says the concept and method is not generally accepted by ethnographers. And also, and the last one is again a reference to Malinowski. He says the method of culture cycles ignores function. And he gives the example of an axe. He says an axe for Mainz is just the expression of a historical tradition. But for someone like Malinowski, it's about felling trees. So it's an adaptation to the environment. Just to give an idea of this school of diffusionism, some key figures in there. Well, I call it the German-Austrian school of diffusionism, the reason being that Fritz Grebner was originally from Germany, and he moved to Austria because he had access to funding to do ethnographic work abroad. But the other members are all Austrian, as far as I know. I think in a way, the most important or the most influential figure in there is probably Fritz Grebner with his Methode der Ethnologie, and this is where the method of culture cycles is defined for the first time. And then Oswald Mainz is the prehistoric archaeologist who tried to adapt it to archaeology. So I've tried, with the book of Fritz Grebner to understand, and I'm sure, for you, it will be even more difficult to understand. It's incredibly difficult to understand what is this Kulturkreislehre or method of culture cycles. So I have to say, I borrowed here another figure from David Clark in 1968, who tried to also look at this early diffusionist work, and he calls it differently. He calls it radio contour theory. Which I think is coming more from the American side, but I think they also borrowed from Fritz Grebner's Methode der Ethnologie. The idea, you could say, is quite simple. If you look at ethnographic societies today, there are specific culture circles and specific traits which are in these areas in between these culture circles. So if you observe these circles and you go back and you try to go back in time, you can basically gradually, by introducing the time element, you can try to trace back those primitive circles. And one use of this method was the book published by Mainz called Weltgeschichte der Steinzeit in 1931, where Mainz argues that there are 3 fundamental cultures in the world, one based on blades, which he associates with Europeans or the white race, because he makes an equation between race and culture, one based on bones that he associates with Asians, the yellow race, and one based on hand axes, which he associates with Africans and with the black race. Again, these are his words, not mine. So the idea, I think, is something like this. So you can look on the geographical horizon, and you will observe, by going back in time, you can try to trace back those ancestral cultures. I think one way to look at it is as an alternative to what was happening at the time in Europe, especially in Western Europe, where from the 1820s onwards, with Christian Jorgensen Thompson, there was the idea of an evolutionist scheme from Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age, and then attempts by, for instance, French archaeologists, people like Gabriel de Mortillet, to define the different evolutionary steps within the Stone Age. So for instance, de Mortillet published a sequence where for the Old Stone Age, you go from Chéléen to Acheléen to Moustérien to Solutréen to Magdalénien. And people like Menguin observed that in Central Europe, it doesn't really work. You don't have the same succession of cultures. So I think that was partly, this diffusionist thing was partly as a reaction to some of the evolutionist ideas that were coming from Western Europe. Then I think Gordon Childe was attracted to more than just this method of cultural cycles. He had also a similar view of prehistory and the significance of prehistory compared to Menguin. So he explains it, I think, quite clearly. He says comparative ethnography is handicapped by its limitation to 2 dimensions. Only with archaeological help can the time factor be reintroduced. So if you think of cultural history as time, space, and form, what he's saying is if you only have space and form, you're losing the most important, or one of the most important dimensions, which is time. If you read Oswald Menguin, for instance, in his Geist und Blut of 1933, Menguin outlines his project for prehistory. Here he calls it Urgeschichte, which is primal or primitive history. And he defines it as like the most important science that encompasses all the others. So historical branches of physical anthropology, paleoethnology, linguistic archaeology, ethnology, and prehistoric archaeology, everything is now within prehistory. And I think this is the same way that Gordon Childe looked at things. One other important aspect to mention is, of course, when Childe was writing Danube in Prehistory, you have to consider that Vienna is right in the center of that dynamic network because of its geographical location between the Alps and the Carpathian Basin. It is, of course, an important center, and Childe, being Australian, he had access to all these different countries, so he could travel freely to all of these different countries. Whereas someone like Menguin, who was from a vanquished state from the First World War, from the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, he couldn't really travel to all of these places. So we have reviews of Menguin where he talks about Childe in very positive terms, and he says that Gordon Childe is the one bringing pictures of all of the different museums that he cannot visit. So I think that's why it was it was very productive in a way relationship between these two prehistorians. And this is another figure from Danube in Prehistory, where you can see all of these cultures that are sort of within each other and so on. Now, one of the important differences between Childe was a lot closer to Oswald Menguin than he was to Cosina. So you have the two figures here. So Gustav Cosina, this Prussian librarian, you might have heard of him, was writing that the first Indo-European speakers in Europe, the Indo-Germanen, as they were called in Germany, that they were not coming from the east, but that they were coming from Northern Europe, from Denmark and Northern Germany. Oswald Menguin, being from Austria and this link to the east, Austria being also a gateway to the east, I think Oswald Menguin was coming more from the Eastern tradition. So he was more of an Orientalist. And I think Gordon Childe always fit better with Menggin than with Cosina in that sense. And we have reviews of work from both Menggin and Cosina. And yeah, so I think it's not right when we hear sometimes Gordon Childe was doing Cosina, like work like Cosina without race. I don't think that's true. So even if you look at his probably most controversial book called The Aryans being the Proto-Indo-European speakers from 1926, what Gordon Childe was saying, and this was fully in agreement with what other writers in Britain were saying at that time, such as Harold Peake or William Perry, is that the Aryans were coming from the Pontic-Caspian steppes, and they were basically what we call today the Yamnaya or Ochre Grave people, and bringing these languages into Europe. So he was never an Occidentalist. I think the relationship between Menggin and Gordon Childe really started to sour around 1933. The reason being that they took completely different political and academic paths. So as soon as Hitler came to power in Germany, Gordon Childe published an article called Is Prehistory Practical, in which he dismissed the notion of race as unscientific, and he hoped to reground prehistory on the evidence of archaeology. And this is in contradiction with some of his early work, including The Aryans, in which he makes simple equations between culture and biology. Menggin, on the other hand, with his Geist und Blut, expressed the greater correspondence between race, language, and culture. And he said that the further back in time you go, the more pure you can observe each of these things, and there's a greater correspondence over time. Menggin also took formal positions, academic and political positions in Austro-fascist and then later Nazi occupation, even though for a short period of time, but you will hear more later in this session. And Gordon Childe was involved in, for instance, the Committee for Race and Culture, which was established in 1934 by the RAI. The idea being to provide a British definition of race and counter the German definition of race. It wasn't just Gordon Childe who was influenced by ideas from the school of Austrian diffusionism. Rivers, who you might know as the president of the RAI from 1921 to 1922, and as a leading member of the School of British Diffusionism, together with Elliot Smith and Perry and so on. It's very interesting because it looks like in 1911, he suddenly converted to diffusionism, and that's how he explains his interest for diffusionism. So Ian Langham, in his book, The Building of British Social Anthropology, explained that that Rivers was aware of the work of Fritz Grebner, his Methode der Ethnologie, already in 1911, and so he tried to rework his own things with the explanation of diffusion. So in a way, you could say the School of British Diffusionism is also a byproduct of the Austrian one. And if you look at some of Elliot Smith's early work, so this is again the School of British Diffusionism. Here you see the migrations of early culture, and there are specific practices that are distributed across the world. And it is very much an application of the method of culture cycles. So in Egypt, it looks like you have all of the traits, all of these practices like megalithic monuments, mummification, sun worship, and so on together. And the further away you go, the more you lose some of that diversity. And this is another map from the School of British Diffusionism, here from William Perry, where you see the diffusion of agriculture from the Mediterranean centers all the way to the world. And that, I think, strongly influenced Gordon Childe and his vision of a spatial distinction between food gatherers and food producers. So that's why Gordon Childe also took a lot of ideas from both Elliot Smith and Menggin, but here he says it clearly. He says, so in 1925, adopting an idea advanced by Elliot Smith 10 years earlier, selected food production as distinguishing the Neolithic from the earlier Paleolithic and Mesolithic. And yeah, and that's it from my side. And I just want to mention that I wrote this article that was in 2019. So if you want to find out more about Gordon Childe's Neolithic Revolution and where it came from, I think I tried to go in more in depth. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Maxime. This is all really, really wonderful stuff. I mean, yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots of things to discuss. I should also say now we turn to our colleagues from Vienna, which will be an absolutely marvelous experience. When we look at the archives of our institute, we have had long, close links with the University of Vienna, and it's wonderful that we can rekindle them in such a profoundly modern way now. So please, Victoria Immervoll, we look forward to your presentation.
Yeah, welcome everybody. So just have to share the screen. Okay. There we go. Yeah, before I start with the presentation, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to this online seminar at the Royal Anthropological Institute. We already got the impression that the 1920s were an important and formative time for the life and career of Gordon Childe. Not only that he turned his back on a career in politics and returned to archaeology, but it was also a period in which Childe established a far-reaching network to institutions and museums in Central and Middle Europe. The following presentation has its focus more on Childe's relation to Austrian archaeologists as well as anthropologists. And the first part of the presentation will thematize the Viennese archaeological network. And my colleague Peter is then going to take over the second part, focusing more on Childe's anthropological network in Vienna. After a short stay in Yorkshire at the summer school of the Labour Research Department, Childe traveled to Vienna in September 1922, which was the starting point for his journeys in Central and Middle Europe. Before Childe even set off on his journey to Austria's capital city, he was already well informed about the current state of archaeology in Central Europe. Childe published his impressions for his British colleagues in the journal Man in August 1922. Which publisher was the Royal Anthropological Institute in London. In this article, Childe also wrote a comment on the situation of the Viennese museum landscape as following. The position of the Vienna museums is, on the other hand, very precarious. The Natural History Museum there undoubtedly contains the most representative collection of prehistoric objects to be found in Central Europe. But the bankruptcy of the state now paralyzes the activity of the museum. We do not know exactly from whom Childe got the information for this article, but there is the assumption that Childe must have been already in contact with someone in Vienna before his journey. What we know is that Childe stayed at the house of the Austrian archaeologist Adolf Mahr during his stay in Vienna. Adolf Mahr was once an aspirant for the Anthropological Ethnographic Department of the Natural History Museum. At the end of the 1920s, he got the position at the National Museum of Ireland, of which he became director in 1934. It was exactly 1 year after he joined the Nazi Party and became a local group leader of the official Nazi Party in Ireland. Although he was a convinced National Socialist and is seen as a highly controversial figure in 20th century Irish history, he can be credited with advancing the work of the museum substantially. Let us come back to Childe and his visit in Austria. The purpose for Childe's journey to Austria was an invitation to examine some unpublished material from the site of Šibenik in Bukovina, today in Ukraine, which was located at the Prehistoric Department of the Natural History Museum. The results of Childe's investigations were very soon published in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute 1 year later, in 1923. Before his arrival in Vienna, Childe was also aware of the death of two important colleagues, Johannes, who was the founder of the chair of Prehistory and Early History. In German, it's named Ur- und Frühgeschichte, at the University of Vienna, and the Czech solicitor and archaeologist Jaroslav Paleady. Paleady was in possession of a very important collection. Both Childe and Maar shared the view that Paliades' knowledge and collection is the key to the interpretation of the painted pottery from Znojmo, today in the Czech Republic, which in turn plays a key role for the entire Danubian area. Childe himself studied the collection after his stay in Vienna, and the stratigraphically established sequence of pottery types provide the basis for Childe's book, The Dawn of the European Civilization, which was published in 1925. However, after the death of Paliade, it was uncertain what will happen to this important collection. Even Adolf Maar tried to acquire the collection for the National History Museum. In a 4-page letter from 1923, he asked US anthropologist Franz Boas for an assessment of the importance of the collection to help Paliades' widow with the sale. Maar did not succeed with acquiring the collection for the museum in Vienna, and the Paliade collection is nowadays part of the holdings of the Moravian Museum in Brno in the Czech Republic. A good friend of Adolf Maar was the Austrian prehistorian and archaeologist Oswald Mengin, who was the first who adopted the culture circle theory as a new methodological framework in prehistory. After the death of Moritz Johannes, he succeeded the chair of prehistory and early history at the University of Vienna and became a full professor in 1922. During this time, he was a member of the secret anti-Semitic network named Bärenhöhle, which consisted of several professors at the University of Vienna. They tried very successfully to influence personnel decisions at the university to prevent Jewish and left-wing academic scholars from obtaining lectureships and professorships. Furthermore, he became rector of the university in Vienna in the years 1935 and 1936. Before the annexation of Austria into the German Third Reich, Mengin became an official member of the Nazi Party, as well as Minister of Culture and Education in the Seyss-Inquart government. He held the position as minister only for 2 months, but it was during this short period that most of the expulsions and dismissals happened at the university. After the Second World War, he fled to Argentina and became a professor at the University of Buenos Aires. As already mentioned above, Mengin was a good friend of Adolf Maar, and there is a high possibility that Mengin and Childe came into physical as well as intellectual contact with each other during Childe's visit in Vienna in 1922. What we know for sure is that both Mengin and Childe knew about each other's work. For instance, Mengin was co-editor of the Wiener Prehistorische Zeitschrift, in which Childe published his first article in 1926. It is very interesting that the article was published in German. So, moreover, reviews of the most important works of Childe were published in this journal as well. On the other hand, Childe wrote his first review of an article by Mengin in 1927, which thematized the role of animal domestication as well as the cultivation of plants in prehistoric times. This article is part of an encyclopedia of nutrition that consists of over 1,200 pages. The fact that Childe chose exactly this article from over 100 articles is a strong indicator that Childe was also valued of Mengin's work. Furthermore, this work of Mengin was an important inspiration for his further reflections on the first emergence of agricultural food production, as he set out in his famous book, Man Makes Himself, in 1936. At this time, he sought contact with academic networks in Vienna that included prehistory. There's also evidence of this. In the same year, in 1927, Childe became a member of the Anthropological Society in Vienna, the oldest society of its kind in Austria. The Anthropological Society in Vienna is comparable to the Royal Anthropological Institute in London. Founded in 1817 in Vienna at the Natural History Museum, it still covers the 3 disciplines of archaeology, physical anthropology, and ethnology. Since Mengin was co-editor of the Mitteilungen der Anthropologischen Gesellschaft, it can be assumed that Megin substantially supported Childe's admission to the society. Let us now turn the focus to Megin's magnum opus, World History of the Stone Age and its development. In the year 1910, Megin heard about the culture circle theory for the first time through a lecture by the ethnologist and priest Wilhelm Schmidt. In the preface of the book, he wrote that after a lecture of Wilhelm Schmidt, it took him 10 more years to get to Grebner's point of view to use the Kulturkreislehre as a methodological framework for a radical new approach in prehistory. In 1922, Megin gave a lecture on the cultural historical method in prehistorical archaeology for the first time at the Third International Religious Ethnological Week, which took place in Tilburg in the Netherlands. It was also attended by Father Wilhelm Koppers, who belonged to the same Catholic order as Father Wilhelm Schmidt did. Since 1923, Megin worked on applying the culture circle theory to archaeology, and Childe knew about Megin's ambitions. It took almost 10 years until Megin published his concept in the World History of the Stone Age in 1931. Megin referred several times on already published results of Childe, such as his analysis of the Gibeonitz collection in 1923. Another interesting fact is that Childe already mentioned Megin's book in a positive way at the end of an article, which was written even before the World History of the Stone Age was published. It is very unusual to write such a note, but it is a hint for us that Childe definitely knew about Megin's forthcoming publication. Furthermore, only a few months after the publication of Megin's book in February 1931, Childe wrote a very positive book review, which was published in the Antiquaries Journal. Let me now briefly discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the World History of the Stone Age. Generally, as we already heard from Maxime, the book was the first work to cover prehistory worldwide. Megin's book was an attempt to introduce a new terminology for the Stone Age. For example, he replaced the term Old Paleolithic with the term Protolithic, which included a Protolithic bone culture. Megin thus postulated a bone age that preceded the Stone Age. He called it Protolithic bone culture, which he associated with the Arctic culture area, where bones played an important role in toolmaking. On the other hand, Megin's terminology was precisely the stumbling block that prevented his book from being accepted in its full scope. For example, the British archaeologist Miles Burkitt had his difficulties with it, calling Megin's terminology as jaw-breaking names in 1934. Finally, important regions such as South America were hardly represented, which was surprising. For South America, the ethnological cultural regions were the best documented. At this point, we still need to answer the question why Childe and some of the British colleagues like Miles Burkitt were so fascinated about the work of Oswald Megin. During this time, there existed the British school of diffusionism with its main proponents, Grafton Elliot Smith and his pupil, William James Parry. They assumed that the origin of all civilization lies in Egypt and can be also defined as hyperdiffusionism. It was seen as pseudo-archaeological and speculative by Childe and some of his colleagues. This is the reason why they looked for an alternative approach in the work of Oswald Megin. An important milestone for the academic relationship between Childe and Megin was the first International Congress of Prehistoric and Protohistoric Sciences, held in London in early August 1932. This Congress was largely conceptualized by Gordon Childe and John Lyndon Myers, who had been president of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland from 1928 to 1931. It was at this Congress that Childe and Megin met in person. The Congress report shows that on August 5, 1932, the two listened to Herbert Kühn's lecture and also commented on it. Herbert Kühn was from Germany, had founded an Institute for Prehistory at the University of Cologne in 1930 and specialized in cave paintings. In his lecture, Origin and Homeland of the Indo-Europeans, He claimed that the original seeds of the Indo-Europeans covered the entire area from southern Scandinavia to the Alps, from the Rhine to the Don, leaving the present question quite open. Yeah, and now I will hand over to my colleague Peter. Thanks for the attention.
We are not hearing you right now, Peter.
So hello, everybody. I think you can hear me. So also
Yes.
yes, it's fine. Huh? Many thanks, also many thanks to the organizers for inviting me and to this great seminar, and special to Hanine and David. As Victoria previously indicated, I will trace Childe's social anthropological contacts in Vienna. To Vienna. First, I propose to clarify when the first rapprochement between a Childe and the so-called Viennese ethnological school took place. The publications show that such contact can be excluded before the 1930s. Mutual citation was through prehistoric, but not by any ethnological channels. There is one exception, what you can see here, however, which confirms this assessment all the more. In 1928, Childe reviewed the extensive Festschrift for the 6th birthday of Father Wilhelm Schmidt, which was added that year by his student Father Wilhelm Koppers. The Festschrift contains 76 contributions, and some of them also deal with prehistory, which must have piqued Childe's interest. However, his
Peter, you are on mute again.
However, his description of Schmidt as a member of the Jesuit order is simply wrong. The review makes clear that Childe neither knew Schmidt nor Koppers personally at that time, nor had he dealt more closely with the contents of the Kulturkreislehre. Schmidt and Koppers belonged to the Catholic Style missionary order, which had been founded in Style, the Netherlands in 1875. The Austrian headquarters are located in St. Gabriel, south of Vienna. At the University of Vienna, the chair of physical anthropology and ethnography was divided in 1929, and Schmidt succeeded in institutionalizing the Kulturkreislehre founded by him in 1912 at the university. Koppers took over as the head of the Institute of the Ethnology. And during the consolidation phase of this new institute, it is evident that Schmidt had reservations about Childe and initially rejected him. This is surprising, and therefore I would like to present the proof. I've got problems to switch my slides. Schmidt's well-known 1935 book, Race and People, quotes Childe at length, saying at one point, also the English archaeologist Childe, who has long vacillated between the Nordic and Southeastern theories, has recently taken a decided turn toward the latter. So the reservations were not, as one might assume, about Childe's Marxist approach, but about academic dispute over the origin of the Indo-Europeans, which was politically highly charged in those years due to the Nazi takeover in Germany in 1933. Schmidt and Koppers held the view that the origin of Indo-Europeans was to be sought in the southern Russian steppes, They rigorously advocated the so-called Eastern thesis and were thus diametrically opposed to the racial doctrines of the Nazi state. Schmidt's book was banned in Germany, and both Schmidt and Koppers were dismissed from the University of Vienna by the Nazis in 1938 in the wake of the so-called Anschluss. The Northern thesis, on the other hand, located Indo-Europeans' origins in Northern Europe. From Schmidt's and Koppers' point of view, Childe was of course not a Nazi, but they saw in him a representative who did not explicitly reject the Northern thesis. And that was apparently enough for them not to trust Childe. The proof of this is found in Childe's major work on the subject, The Aryans, published in 1926. It states, thus, the great majority of the Aryan nations of historical times can be shown to be descended from the Nordic battle axe folk of the Stone Age. By the aid of pottery and weapons, they can be traced back with more or less certainty to one of the two centers, South Russia or Scandinavia. The first business of future researchers must be determine which of these really has their priority. So in 1926, Childe was indeed indifferent about the origin of the Aryans, which is often overlooked. As we've seen, Schmidt nevertheless emphasized that Childe had switched from being a representative to the Northern to the Eastern thesis. When and in what context this happened can be found in a paper by Koppers. In April 1935, he published The Indo-European Question in the Light of Ethnology in the journal Anthropos, in which he reported on Childe. The Childe no longer trusts the Northern thesis in any way today. He emphatically emphasized on the occasion of the International Congress of Anthropology and Ethnology in London in summer of 1934. It was at this Congress in London that Childe and Koppers first met. Koppers gave the same lecture on his publication in early August 1934, and Childe was among the audience and also commented at length on Koppers' lecture. Since leading anthropologists from Nazi Germany, such as Eugen Fischer, also attended the Congress, the question of whether the Congress should be a public platform to take a stand against the Nazi racial doctrine was hotly debated in advance. As its Secretary General, John Linton Myers, that is, as we heard, one of Childe's teachers, was the leading organizer of this Congress. Correspondence between Myers and Koppers reveals that the Austrian physician Ignaz Zollshan played an important role. Zollshan, who was a committed Zionist, intended to present at the Congress a so-called racial enquête to refute the Nazi racial doctrine. Koppers was in favor of this agenda, but at the end, Zollshan did not get a chance to speak at the Congress, as it was decided not officially politicize the Congress. Childe was probably not satisfied with this decision to keep day-to-day politics out of the Congress. A few months earlier, between October 1933 and March 1934, he had published 4 articles in which he explicitly attacked the racist ideology of the Nazi state. First, he criticized the concept of the Aryan race in general. In particular, the Nazi claimed that Aryans were racial superior. Finally, he criticized the political instrumentalization of prehistory in the Nazi state, the guidelines issued by Interior Minister Frick for teaching history in German schools, and especially the bizarre cultural concepts in Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Childe even suggested that the word race should be banned from science. He thus anticipates with Julian Huxley and Alfred Cordd Hatton actually achieved with his success in their famous book, We Europeans in 1935. They advocated replacing race with ethnic group, a term that has become widely acceptable in anthropology to this day. So it should be noted that Childe's public relations work against the Nazis happened right between the two London congresses. When Childe and Coppers first met in London, they had an important common base for future scientific cooperation on the so-called Indo-European question. And so it happened. When it became apparent that the Festschrift for Hermann Hirt, the leading Indo-Europeanist in Nazi Germany, was planned to substantiate and expand the Northern thesis with the methodology of cultural history and anthropology with over 40 contributions, Coppers and 8 colleagues decided to publish a rebuttal. This refutation was intended to reinforce the Eastern thesis. And among these contributors was Gordon Childe, with whom Coppers also corresponded in advance. The concluding sentence of Childe's essay, The Antiquity of Nordic Culture, read, if Indo-Germanen, German word, really be the agents in the diffusion of the stone battle axe, they cannot have started from Denmark, but must have arrived there quite late in their wanderings. So battle axes and corded ware pottery were considered as guide fossils for Indo-European migration, the origin of which Childe did not locate in Northern Europe as the proponents of the Northern thesis claimed. The cooperation between Childe and Coppers therefore was brief but intensive and was not resumed after the end of the World War II. However, there would have been an opportunity to do so. Coppers had returned from Swiss exile to liberated Austria in December 1945, where he regained his previous chair. In 1948, Childe was invited by the Austro-British Society in Vienna to give a lecture. The lecture was accompanied by numerous press reports. Nothing is known of any renewed meeting between Coppers and Childe on that occasion. On the contrary, in 1956, Childe published the book Piecing Together the Past, in which he comments on the Austrian diffusionists. Their claim implies a theory of culture as a mechanical delegate of cultural traits that sociologists unanimously condemn as unscientific. So by the mid-1950s, Childe thus firmly rejected the Kulturkreislehre. This is not a surprise, because his rejection became at a time when Coppers himself had already revoked the theory of culture circles. In the second part of my presentation, I would like to discuss an issue that is usually overlooked in the history of research. The proponents of the Kulturkreislehre should not be understood as a unified monolith. No unified opinion existed. There were heated debates and internal fractures were the result. One example seems to me to be thematically relevant. It concerns the academic relationship between Coppers and Oswald Mengin, which was initially very fruitful. It was Coppers who introduced Mengin to the theory of culture circles. But 15 years of collaboration then broke up in 1931 and lay in ruins. What had happened? The trigger was Coppers' book Review of Mengin's World History of the Stone Age. It runs 23 pages and shows that Coppers did not agree with Mengin's conceptions at all. The adjustment of Kulturkreislehre to prehistory was made too hastily because the ethnological cultural circles themselves were still too poorly secured, he argued. The main point of Copper's criticism concerned Mengine's positioning on the Indo-European question. In his highly influential work, Mengine advocated the Northern thesis, which was incompatible with the Kulturkreislehre. So after the publication of the book Review in Anthropos in June 1931, Mengine no longer understood the word. He saw Koppers as the main representative of the Kulturkreislehre and had not expected such a negative review from him. Moreover, Koppers' criticism was followed by other negative reviews by prehistorians in Germany. Mengine communicated his disappointment to a historian in Germany. It was a mistake, after all, that I cast the book before swine, that is, before the German academic public, instead of having it published in English, as I initially intended. Surprisingly, British archaeologists reacted the other way around. Robert McAllister and Miles Burkitt were so enthusiastic about Mengine's book that they repeatedly requested an English translation. The approving response was thus far greater in UK than in Germany or Austria. The biblical Luther quote, "casting pearls before swine," illustrates the impasse in which Mengine found himself. Without the acceptance of the ethnological cultural circles, his book was almost worthless. Mengine then switched, as did Kopper's assistant Fritz Kopper, from the Catholic to the Nazi camp, which was banned from party politics in Austria from June 1933. Mengine and Flohr did not support Koppers and Childe in 1936, but that group which represented the Northern thesis of Hermann Hirt. When the aforementioned historian from Germany visited Vienna in the summer of 1936, Mengine warned him, relationship with St. Gabriel's quite bad. If you come to us, please be careful to separate the circles. Social gathering with Koppers, impossible. So the question for us is whether Childe has heard anything about these Vienna confrontations. I think I can answer this question positively. Evidence is found in Childe's presidential address, which was already mentioned by Brami, changing methods and aims in prehistory to the prehistoric society in the fall of 1935. The lecture deals at length with Mengine's book. Childe's statement was no longer that praise song as it was in his 1931 book review. He found 4 basic criticisms and concluded with the following assessment. The culture cycle as a methodological device deserves most serious consideration by archaeologists. It may be a revolutionary innovation, but is still very much on its trial. This assessment corresponds exactly to the words of Koppers. Koppers too called the Kulturkreislehre, in contrast to Schmidt, still in the experimental stage. Since Mengine also advocated the Northern thesis in the context of Nazism, Childe distanced from him the latter's work. Thus, the March 1937 press photo used for this seminar is actually anachronistic, as it no longer corresponds to historical reality. Contrary to what the photo depicts, the academic relationship between the two world-renowned prehistorians had by then cooled considerably, possibly even ended. After World War II, Childe became even more explicit in this regard. In 1946, Childe published his study, Archaeology and Anthropology, in which he described Mengine's diffusionist approach as shreds and patches theory of culture that he already rejected. This distancing can also be seen in the context of denazification. A few months earlier, Mengine was placed on the list of Austrian war criminals along with 80 others. In fact, he had been a member, as we heard, of the same transitional Austrian government of March 1938 that handed over power to the German invaders. Mainz was the Minister of Education, and it was under his office that the many university dismissals took place. A few weeks before his escape to Argentina, we have a statement about exactly how Mainz thought about Childe. The question was whether Childe should collaborate on the Historia Mundi or not. Mainz refused and justified this as follows. As much as I appreciate him as a professional, he's incompatible with me and Father Schmidt as an outspoken materialist and Marxist who has always sympathized with the communists. I come to the conclusion of my talk by trying to classify Childe's diffusionist approach in relation to Vienna. The renowned archaeological historian Clint Daniel, who knew Childe personally, concluded that Childe represents convincing moderate diffusionism. While his assessment is correct, it overlooks the changes and relationships with the Austrian diffusionists during the interwar period. Daniel uses the term moderate only to distinguish Childe from Grafton, Elliott Smith, and Perry, whose Egyptocentrism is known to represent a one-sided and extreme form of cultural diffusionism. Thus, the term moderate does not get to the heart of the matter, because Koppers and Schmidt also rejected that extreme form of British pan-Egyptologism. As I've shown, Nazism exerted a profound influence on Childe's prehistoric diffusionist conception. The Nazis' ultra-nationalist and racist view of prehistoric data was at odds with Childe's worldview, and he sought a method to refute such interpretations. The diffusionist concept of the Vienna Kulturkreislehre assumed that the present-day cultures arose through mixing. It was anti-nationalist and also contained a humanist component. Cultures did not emerge in isolation. They influenced each other through diffusion. To invalidate the ideology of Nazism, Koppers used the phrase in a lecture in 1937, "Nothing has arisen endogenously." And Childe asserted the same. In his article War and Culture in the same year, the article argues that cultural progress is achieved only through peaceful exchange, that is, through diffusion and not through violent conquest. There is no progress in isolation, he argued. Any man or group of men can learn from each other. Even before written history begins, the prehistoric archaeologists can see it in operation and studies it under the name of diffusion. Cultural progress has resulted from the pooling of the experiences of all people, not from the survival of one people's experiences to the exclusion of all others. This seems to me to have been the common intellectual base of Childe's and Koppers' thinking. It was a humanist concept of diffusion to ward off Nazism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Peter and Victoria, for these splendid presentations. I think what we can say clearly is that the fundamental proposition of our four scholars today is certainly proven. There is no doubt whatsoever that there was a fantastically fruitful creative engagement. between Childe and the Austrian school of diffusion. So I think we can certainly say that our prime aim of this afternoon has been properly illustrated. Just a tiny point, because I'm anxious to turn to colleagues for questions. With regard to the controversy within the 1934 Congress that you talked about, Peter, interestingly enough, it was Grafton Smith, whom earlier was said, of course, to be close to Childe, who was actually spearheaded the attempt to reintroduce into the Congress a condemnation of the Nazi understanding of race. And indeed, it's quite true that Myers suppressed it at the conference because his vision of academic contact was that one should remain on speaking terms with one's colleagues, even in enemy countries. But privately, it was he and Childe who got together to publish the announcement of the Germany's racial education policies. So you see, he was working on more than one level at the same time. But it's an absolutely fascinating thing that was going on. And I imagine Zoltan must have been absolutely infuriated at the lack of public progress that he could make. Anyway, that's just a tiny point. We're very fortunate to have Professor Gingrich with us, who has put his hand up, and whom I would like to invite to open up our discussion. Now, the question is, can we get Professor Gingrich to speak live for us, Henny?
Yes, he can unmute and speak now.
Great, go ahead. Very nice to see you, or hear you, or both.
From Sri Lanka, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed, go ahead.
Maxime, you discussed the Eastern and Northern thesis in their context of the 1930s. And just to enlighten the sociocultural anthropologists among us, I raised this question also in the chat. From today's perspective, isn't it an opinio communis that if any origins of Indo-German, Indo-European movements to Europe and beyond can be identified at all, that they came indeed from southern Russia and northern Iran, and therefore would rather be seen as confirming in hindsight the Eastern thesis? Question mark.
Thank you for your question. Well, first of all, it's incredibly complicated because it's about genetics, culture, linguistics. It's several things brought together. And I think there's no firm answer at the moment. But what I can say is, and this goes back to what Peter was saying about Gordon Childe, the Aryan of 1926, when he said that he wrote about the Nordic battle axe culture. You have to understand that what Gordon Childe calls the battle axe culture corresponds to several archaeological cultures, as we would call them today. That includes the Yamnayas that are coming, or the Ochre people that are coming from the Pontic-Caspian steppes that you also find in Southeast Europe. And that includes the corded ware culture, both from the third millennium, but the corded ware culture you find in Central Europe. And the problem is the following. So Gordon Childe calls battle axe culture these two cultures. What he calls Nordic is about the race, because it's the Nordic race he identifies with the battle axe culture. Okay, we can discuss this, but the problem is for the Yamnayas, the Ochre people, it looks like they are going from the east to the west, okay? But if you look at the corded ware, which is in Central Europe, they are going from Central Europe to the east. So, and this was, for instance, shown by Tallgren, a Finnish prehistorian, that Gordon Childe was in contact with. And what we know is that when Gordon Childe was writing the Aryans, up until the end, he was still hesitant about where things coming from the east going to the west, or where things going from the west to the east. And in the end, it shows that it was going from the east to the west, which was also the view in Britain. But I think from an archaeological point of view, you could say it's complicated. So that's my answer.
But from the north to the south doesn't even come up in your discussion of the present state of insights. So that aspect obviously is obsolete, question mark?
Of course, it is obsolete. I mean, no one seriously believes that things were coming from, I think some of the Nazis even claimed that the Indo-Europeans were coming from, what was it, from all the way on the North Pole. There was a book claiming that it was ex-septentrione, looks, everything came from the North. Yes, I think that hypothesis is probably obsolete. But the question is, for this battle axe culture, again, it looks like there's something going from the east to the west. And then once it's gone from the east to the west, it probably goes again from the west to the east. So it is complicated, even today, I would say.
Thank you.
Andre, whilst you're with us, do you have any more general remarks you would like to make about the theme that we're discussing today? If so, we should be delighted to hear them.
No, I think our speakers had an extremely fine-tuned focus on the state of the art in the 20s and 30s. I thank each of you. It is important to also emphasize that this dialogue between archaeology and anthropology was really extremely fruitful and in a way was interrupted and cut short by politics at the time. And we might learn from it from today, for today, and for the future, because it continues to have a lot of potentials in it. And I would be interested to know how our speakers think about these potentials for the present and the future.
Well, thank you very much. Should we go in reverse order from the way I began to speak briefly, perhaps each in turn? Do you want to begin, Peter, and we'll go backwards? What about this? What do you think of this general question?
First, I would like to answer your remark on this first Congress of Anthropology and Ethnology. Of course, I know this very influential talk of Elliot Smith, and also this talk is mostly overlooked. It is ignored that he criticized the Nazi racial doctrine during this specific Congress, which was actually not allowed. It's not to say not allowed, but it was not assured before. And we know that Linton Myers with Seligman and others played in the background to criticize the racial doctrines of the Nazis. But this I didn't focus on my paper this time. I agree with Andre Gingrich that all these debates which we have presented in the late 20s, early 30s, that the political impact was really forcing the scientific conclusions, as I've shown, for instance, with this switch of Mengin and Floor. Floor was the assistant of Koppes, you can imagine. So his assistant switched from Catholic camp to the Nazi camp. And it was for Koppes really completely not understandable. How could this happen? And Mengin, the split in 1931, there was no discussion, no cooperation after that at all. And this we can find with the correspondence, which some of them we have got, by the publications, to study only the publications, it's rather difficult to find the atmosphere, the politically charged atmosphere in those days.
Thank you very much. And Victoria, what do you think about the cooperation between archaeology and anthropology and politics? Well, you might need to unmute, yes.
Sorry.
Very good.
Do you think politics or in general?
Well, I think the point is whether we can overcome, it's the old question, these political complications in the research that we're trying to do.
Yes, I think we can overcome these problems or issues. But yeah, we will see.
Yes, I suppose it depends on the context. And what do you think, Maxime?
Of course. Yeah.
This is always interfering with the stuff you're looking at, of course.
Well, I remember attending some events, I think organized by André Gingrich, where I really learned that in Central Europe, especially in Germany, the number of chairs in archaeology increased massively during the Nazi era. So that's one way to look at it, in the sense that back in the 1920s, 1930s, you could say that prehistory was incredibly practical. That's why Gordon Childe called his study, his article, Is Prehistory Practical? Because at the time it was part of this Rassenkunde and so on. So it played a role it had a political role to play, which I think Gordon Childe criticized. I don't think that's the case anymore. So when you hear about the impact of your work and big society and so on, maybe we have to be careful and think about what was happening in the 1920s, 1930s when prehistory was incredibly practical. Yeah, I think for Gordon Childe, prehistory, especially in the 1930s and 1920s, that was a way for him to do politics by other means. So although he left his career as a political figure already by 1922, I think his work, I mean, although it's devoted to prehistory, I fear that he was trying to carry a lot of messages, and that's clear. If you read Man Makes Himself, he talks about Herr Hitler in the first few pages, and he explained that it's about progress against the retardation that Nazi Germany is bringing onto Europe. You could say the Danube in prehistory is about reuniting different parts of Europe, Southeast Europe, Northwest Europe. You could say the Aryans, although yes, of course, did he fall for the Cosina or more for the Nordic view, or everything came from the East? I think in the end it shows the East, and I think he still says that the Aryans are civilization wreckers. They are the one destroying civilization. So in a way, he's also bringing a new twist on the story of the Aryans. So it's all about politics in many ways. And yeah, I think I should probably stop here.
Well, thank you very much. And Katie, what do you think, looking from your point of view?
From my point of view, when I look at the early connections between them, I think it's an identity issue. And I think archaeology and social anthropology form themselves as new disciplines almost through dispute with one another. So they need to fight with one another to have something to kind of react against to form their own identity. And it's often the way how you form these distinct identities of the disciplines in conflict with others, then you pull away and push back. But as a librarian, when I look at the books in the library, I can see that archaeology and anthropology never move far away from one another. There's almost cycles, for want of a better term, when they move far away from one another and then back to one another. So they're constantly, as disciplines, they form and reform almost together in association and in conflict with one another. So the 90s was a great period of time when they were close together and then they pulled back again. And when I buy new books, I can see hints of them coming together again now. So it's this constant ebb and flow. So I think they have an internal relationship, which which changes as the disciplines form and change. But in any subject, and archaeology swallows in all of these subjects and then turns it all again and spits it out, you have to think of the audience who are reacting to what academics produce. So you can put your message out however you want to put your message out, but also it's never going to be it's never necessarily going to be taken and processed more widely in the way you want it to be. And I think this is also the question you see in the 20s and 30s. They start with messages, and some of these messages are political messages, but to another extent, they put the message out there and the messages are used. And I think we all know that Childe never republished the Aryans because he was so distressed at the use that was made of his message by others. So I think you always have to think of that other factor in play when you think about politics, is no matter what you put out there in your terms of what you want to do with your work, people may interpret it differently, and that's how it should be necessarily, because it's free academic thought and debate.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I see that Alice Cahill has a question which I want to come on to, but before that, Katie, do you want to respond to Robert McDowell's question, where he says Childe was clearly an intellectually restless character. What motivated him? What did he see as his purpose and his role? And did intellectual frustration contribute to his suicide? What do you think?
I completely agree. Childe was an extremely restless person. And Robert might be interested to know that amongst our Childe archive, we have a diary where he kept, which is basically a travelogue where he just wrote all the places he went. So it's almost like he went here, he went there, he went there, he went there, in this long trailing list of the distances he moved. And he was a very restless academic. In some of the letters he writes to John Myers, he writes that he travels because he's feeling stale and depressed. And I think traveling for Childe was a constant search for knowledge, but I also think he was sometimes using it to run away from some of his own internal depression and problems.
And you've got nothing to say about why he committed suicide, which is the final part of the question?
Why he committed suicide is a very, very complicated question. A lot of people view it in terms of kind of reaction to contemporary politics, the Hungarian invasion. When you look at his security service files, you can see actually he was very active with the Chinese Communist Party, and he remained this right until his death. I don't really have a clear answer of why he did it, because throughout all the information I've seen, I get two pictures of Childe's last days. The first one is Childe was obviously in one ways not committed. He had accepted a chair back at the Institute of Archaeology as an emeritus professor. He'd left papers on his desk in the Institute of Archaeology because these had to be packed up and put in a trunk. So he obviously was, to one extent, planning to come back, but at the other time, he also said to people that he was intending to throw himself off a mountain. So I think Childe himself didn't make that decision until the very last minute. And I think there was, as he said in his letter, that he was depressed, he was growing old. I don't think he quite knew what to do with his retirement. I think it's an incredibly complicated question to which I'm afraid I don't really see a clear answer.
Well, thank you very much. Well, and then Alice Cahill asked whether there was a connection between Childe and Boas, who was also, of course, actively campaigning against Nazism. Indeed, famously, of course, he died whilst he was campaigning against Nazis and against racism. So does anybody know if there was a connection? I open this up to any of our speakers. Have they looked at this side to Childe's life?
So I had a look through the Boas archive, and there's only the whole Boas archive is online. There's only, I believe, 2 letters written between Childe and Boas, and he wrote them, and Peter, I think, seen as well, he's nodded. He wrote them when he was librarian at the RAI, just asking for books. And I got really excited when I saw that archive online, and I thought I would find more evidence there, but there's nothing that I can find. So if there were influences, it was not at first hand, in my opinion, from what I've seen of that archive.
Any more comments about this aspect from anybody? Please.
I agree with that, Katie. I also read the same letters, and it's true there are so few, and they are from the earlier period, from the 20s. But we know that there are letters between Bowers and Elliot Smith, and after or during this Congress in 1934. And Childe and Elliot Smith played a decisive role in, to create something on race to fight against the Nazi doctrine. And I would say Elliot Smith, Childe, and Elliot Smith and Bowers. This is a circle. There was a communication. So I would say Childe was well informed what Bowers did and reacted on the Nazi regime after Hitler got power in 1933. So
Yes, maybe simply his focus was more towards Europe. And Bowers, of course, was doing all the ethnography in North America. And also communication was more difficult in those days. I don't know whether, Maxime, you have any thought about that. Do you see any North American influences in Childe's thought?
This not so much, but I'm not too familiar with this. But I have to say that Bowers, of course, also wrote some reviews of the work of Fritz Grebner, for instance, Methode der Ethnologie, and he was highly critical because he called it mechanistic. He thought that didn't really work. So sometimes you hear this is the American school of diffusionism with Bowers, and I think that's not entirely true. I think they were on these were quite different things. Yeah.
Please.
So I have a question to Maxime. I studied your brilliant work, and the question to me was the intellectual influences on Childe about diffusionism, the method of diffusionism. And of course, we agree that Elliot Smith and Perry, their approach, they were too simple, and Childe criticized it and finally rejected this approach. And then he switched over to the diffusionist to Vienna for a short period, and then he rejected them again. Huh? So in a short sense, but before he came in contact with Elliot Smith and Perry, he already adopted approach of diffusionism. I found this in his early books, The Aryans, and the other one, this Danube book, 1926. And there he cites Oscar Montelius from Sweden. And he used the word diffusionism. So actually Montelius was a very important prehistorian who influenced Childe. And Oscar Montelius died in 1921, so very early in. So there was actually he died when Childe started his career. But what about this Montelius?
Yes, I think that's a very valid point. The work of Montelius was, of course, very important because Montelius claimed that everything came from the East. So he was again an Orientalist, and I think that's why Gordon Childe was, I think, interested in his work. Beside the fact that Montelius was classifying, objects from the Bronze Age, which is again the Aryans was also dealing with a particular period. Yes, for sure. I think Montelius was probably never. There was never a school of diffusionism named after Montelius, but he was a very important figure and a very different one from Cosina. Yeah, I agree.
And we have another question from Professor Gingrich, this time to you, Katie. And he's Professor Gingrich asks whether there's anything in the communist papers of either the Communist Party papers of either Australia or Britain, which reflects upon Childe at all. Is there any information in them, I wonder?
So Childe's most kind of public connection with the Communist Party of Britain was in the work of the Communist Party Historians Group and the journal Past and Present. I've tried to look for archives for past and present in particular. The problem is that a lot of communists at that time were aware that they were being watched very carefully by the security services, and a lot of them destroyed their papers. He was very close friends with an academic known as Benjamin Farrington. Farrington's archive does not exist. Eric Hobsbawm's archives, he destroyed huge chunks of it during his time. John Morris, who was editor of Past and Present, also destroyed huge numbers of their papers at this time because they felt that any time they could be arrested or charged or investigated. The best source of information on Childe, ironically, comes from the British security services, who kept him under observation from 1914 and then with the Australian security services until his death in 1957. I'm going to do something I hate now, which is to say I have a paper that's due out in a book later this year, which looks at the question you're asking me, which is about the reports kept on Childe by the security service and his political activities. So that is ironically our best source. It comes from a hostile source, which is the security service papers.
Thank you.
Alas, we're out of time, and we try not to go over. But this is obviously an absolutely fascinating debate, and all we can say is I hope that we will have the chance to revisit this kind of question in the future, and that colleagues will free to join us again to discuss them. So thank you very much indeed to all our paper givers, to our audience, and thank you very much indeed, Hanine, for organizing this event. And please, if you're not already a fellow of the Institute, do feel free to join us, because it's only because we have fellows that we can have events like this. We're completely, as it were, a civil society organization from that point of view. So thank you very much indeed. And I'll say good night from London, and I look forward to being in contact again.